Thanks for coming. We're really happy to have all of you here. We're going to talk about data standards and how they get built, the actual mechanics, the actual steps that go into building data standards. And I think that's a really important discussion. It's funny, we were just talking about how long we've been sort of in this space, and it's Phil Ashlock, another panelist here, is somebody I met over an open data standard, basically, a data standard around 311 service requests, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the unifying theme of this discussion is the use of GitHub and related tools that allow for collaboration and inclusiveness, and why they make a really good foundation for building standards for data. So I'm Mark Head. I'm a developer evangelist with a company called Excella. I'm formerly a city employee at the City of Philadelphia, and a former Code for America employee as well. We also have Renata Majaj, who is a analyst at the US Treasury and someone who's doing some groundbreaking work at the federal government on data standards, and Phil Ashlock, who is the senior engineer, chief architect of data.gov, someone whose work on open data and standards we're all still learning from. So we're really happy to have Phil with us as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do probably 12 minutes or so. You're going to hear 3 different stories about building data standards and how we used GitHub to do that. We're each going to tell our story, and then after that we're going to have a discussion and take some questions, and we're going to walk out that door ready to build more data standards. So sounds like a plan. So Renata, do you want to start us out?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Great. Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm happy to talk about our sausage making of data standards for the Data Act. So a little bit of background about myself and where I work. I'm part of the U.S. Treasury Department, Bureau of the Fiscal Service, and our office is charged with implementing the Data Act, for long, it's the Digital Accountability Transparency Act. And it expands federal spending transparency. So right now, is anyone familiar with usaspending.gov? Couple. Okay, it's okay. The data's kind of bad. Agencies won't even look at it because they also say it's kind of bad. So what the Data Act does is actually expands the amount of data available. It requires agencies to report not just spending on procurement and grants and other financial assistance, but also the total spending. So how much do they get appropriated? What's the unobligated balance? How much do they spend on salaries, on travel, on training, and other things? And then also, how much do they spend on contracts and grants? So this is a pretty revolutionary thing in my space. It's sort of like been the boogeyman for a long time, and it finally got enacted last year. So very excited to see it be implemented. So part of the Data Act is actually requires Treasury and the Office of Management and Budget to set data standards around federal financial management data. And this is no easy task. We have lots of federal standards. The procurement community has federal standards. The budget community has their own standards. The accounting community has their own standards. So now we had to work together to agree on, one definition for the word obligation that we could all agree upon for federal spending transparency. And before I go into sort of the challenges that we had in setting data standards, I want to talk a little bit about how Treasury and OMB have been approaching this challenge. Our approach is really one of creating value by implementing this piece of legislation. So, normally when Congress implements or enacts a law, it's sort of a compliance exercise for the bureaucrats. Okay, how are we going to do this thing? But this was unfunded. There was no money attached to it. So Treasury and OMB had really the challenge of convincing agencies to work towards setting data standards and also implementing this relatively challenging piece of legislation at a time where there's no funding and lots of other priorities. And so the way that we sold it, and we continue to sell it, and I truly believe this, it's not just a sales pitch, this is not a compliance exercise. It's really expanding federal making data more accessible, not just for the public, but also for internal decision makers. So our tagline has been, better data, better decisions, better government. Enable those policymakers, those budget analysts to make better decisions about how they allocate federal dollars. So that's really been our goal. So let me go back to the challenge of federal spending data. Sorry. So we had several challenges in actually. I'm sorry. It's 5 o'clock in DC right now, and we're actually trying to release our next version of our schema, so that's probably that call. Sorry. Okay, so the challenge we faced was, number one, we need to set data standards. It's a statutory requirement to actually engage the public to get feedback on those standards. The standards need to be machine readable, platform independent. We need to leverage existing industry standards. In setting these standards, we know that there's a diverse set of stakeholders. The federal government spends $3.5 trillion every single year. So there's a lot of people interested in how these monies are displayed or what standards come along with them. So we had to work with the public, Congress, academics, transparency advocacy groups, the diverse set of stakeholders within the federal government, so procurement community, budget community, accounting community. So it's very challenging to come up with one single definition for a particular data element. We also had a short implementation timeline. So the Data Act gave Treasury and OMB 1 year to set data standards, which is like rocket speed for federal government. It also has these standards have broad implications. So like I said, the $3.5 trillion that goes out each year, that has impacts on business processes, systems, both on the federal side as well as the recipient side. So I've already explained the challenges, and it's clear that the status quo just doesn't work to get these standards created within 1 year. In the past, we've used the Federal Register notice, which is like a several month-long process, and very arcane, and only people who are really paying attention actually read the notice and provide comments. Even in-person meetings like town hall events aren't effective because they don't reach the full stakeholder audience that we need to reach. And we also needed to avoid triggering other federal laws like FATCA, which is a 1972 law that sets parameters around establishing government committees. So in comes the solution, which is GitHub. So with the nudge of the Office of Science and Technology Policy and 18F and the awesome example of data.gov and Project Open Data, we actually ended up forking Project Open Data and set up our own federal spending transparency collaboration page. And I'll pull that up right now. So this is not fancy because I'm not a coder at all, and I was able to fork this. Oh my gosh, I'm very sorry. I was able to fork this off of the Project Open Data site. So we set up our own collaboration page, and this is really our method of communicating to the public what data elements we had out for comment. So we had all of the data elements listed here, and as you can see now, the feedback period has closed, but a person could go on and follow the conversation on data standards. So for example, here we ask for feedback on recipient legal entity name and ID. Right now we're using the DUNS number, which is a proprietary number. And this conversation actually generated a whole lot of feedback that actually made an impact on policy. So the feedback period is closed, but I just want to show you some examples of the feedback we got and talk to you about the results. So, we asked what kind of standards should we use to identify entities for the federal government. And we got lots of feedback about, non-proprietary, Philip actually commented a very substantive and great comment. Really long one. Felt really strongly about it.
I copied the JO.
Yeah, right. But it was actually really helpful because we were sitting around, a bunch of bureaucrats in front of this interagency advisory committee going through these GitHub comments, and everyone was seeing how substantive and important these comments were, and they really helped helped change the decision. So anyway, I won't go through all the comments, but in the end, what we ended up doing was we said, okay, well, it's a really huge change to totally go away from using the DUNS number, the proprietary number, but what we will do is commit to establishing a process for exploring other ways to identify recipients. So be that the legal entity identifier or other types of identifiers. And we've committed to a timeline. So that really forced OMB and Treasury to commit to moving forward with a plan for change. That's probably the most substantive one. So anyway, I'll go back to showing you how we collected the feedback. We also, so these are the data definitions. We also collected feedback on the data exchange standard. So we're calling this the data X Schema, and this is actually the technical representation of how we're going to actually communicate this federal spending data. So we were able to publish, it's not up yet, well, version 0.6 is coming up very soon, but we were able to publish the XML version of our schema as well as a description. And we're able to get some comments back on that. And I think the biggest lesson learned here is being open by default really helps along the way. So you don't have to go through this crazy clearance process to get the next version out. It's just like, well, we've already decided that we're iterating out in the open. So we're just releasing the next version. There's always going to be a little bit of clearance, but it's not as crazy as the normal clearance, which can take months and months to go through. Let's see. We also, I'll talk a little bit about the lessons learned. So one lesson learned is don't be afraid to ask for feedback. To be honest, we're afraid of putting these standards out there. We weren't sure what kind of responses we would get or if we would get any. And we actually got lots of very substantive responses, as you could see, that really informed policymaking. Make sure to adhere to existing policies. So we kind of went ahead and did this, sort of followed the approach of ask for forgiveness later and just do it. And there were some policies around Paperwork Reduction Act and records retention that we were able to deal with, but I think upfront, having considered those, it would have been probably more streamlined along the way. Biggest lesson learned is have a plan for responding to feedback upfront. So we were talking, I'm relatively new to this space and our office is really new to this space. And we've been getting a lot of encouragement from folks like Phil and OSTP and 18F to use these kinds of tools, but we didn't necessarily know how to deal with it once we got it. So we got a lot of criticism actually about our lack of response to some of to people's postings on issues. Because we didn't know, we were like, do I respond to this, or do we respond under a different name or a generic name? How do we deal with this? So going forward, we're going to work on that. And don't get cold feet. So there was one moment I can think of where, so we've been working with 18F. It was a kind of a startup organization within the federal government that's full of IT folks that are very innovative. And the way that they develop is it's open by default. So they develop out in the open on GitHub. And there's one part that we're working on, it's on the pilot, and we didn't know that they were doing it out in the open, and when we found out, we sort of freaked out. We said, oh no, this is not ready, we can't share this. But then after sleeping on it, we said, okay, well actually, we're just working on this. This is a pilot. This is not formal guidance. It's not anything proprietary, or we're not releasing any sensitive information. Let's just continue to develop out in the open. And that's actually been really helpful. Now when we speak at events and conferences and when we talk to agencies, we just say, well, if you want to know more, take a look at our GitHub site. It's all out there. And they're like, oh, okay. I'll just show you. I've actually pulled up that site. We use Waffle to help manage our user stories, and we post everything out on GitHub. So it's all out there. If you want to actually put something in our backlog and say, okay, as a citizen, I want to be able to see spending by fiscal year, you can actually submit that as a backlog item, and we will work on it. So just to close up, next steps. We want to continue to iterate out in the open. We are continuing to release versions of the data exchange schema, or the data act schema, and we want feedback on that. In the future, we'll be working on a more formal governance process. So, data standards aren't final. They're always living and breathing, and need to have a process for actually getting updated regularly. And we're also going to be, as we implement the Data Act, we're going to want to get feedback and engage the public on the actual visualizations and display of the data. So this is a screenshot of our beta site. It's not out yet. There's still some ATO, authority to operate issues, but we're getting there. And so it's all centered around, we want the public to tell us how they want to see the data, what's useful to them, how do they use the information, what visualizations are most useful to them. Okay, with that, I will hand it over.
Very important part of the data standards process. The arranging of seats.
Hi. So I'm going to first sort of go into a little background and detail on Project Open Data, and then I think I'll go from there into some other standards work I've worked on in the past, like Open 3.1. But so Project Open Data is really the implementation guidance and sort of the living documentation for the federal government's open data policy, which was established as an executive order in spring of 2013, and then set milestones and sort of process for agencies to implement on sort of a quarterly basis. The first major milestone was in the fall of 2013. And I actually joined data.gov right in the fall of 2013, actually right around this time of the year, just a few days before the government shut down, which is a great time to start working in government. And a lot of my job over the past 2 years in that position has been helping agencies implement this policy. So I operate out of GSA. The policy is overseen by the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, with a lot of championing and support from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and sort of a growing community of chief data officers at agencies and other sort of similar points of contact. And so Project Open Data as a sort of GitHub-based project sort of predated my involvement. I was actually, before joining Data.gov, I was a presidential innovation fellow for a short 6-month period, and was actually involved a little bit in some of the finalization of the executive order. But the two people that I think have sort of contributed to architecting this process and this project probably the most were Ben Balter, who was working in government at the time, is now actually at GitHub, and Haley Van Dyke, who was working in the CIO's office. Steve Van Rokel was the CIO at the time, was also, I think, very supportive of this. And they were really just ambitious and sort of willing to take risks of doing an open data, doing a policy through a living collaborative document. So it's the first and perhaps the only, to this day, executive order that actually references, a GitHub project as the place to look for documentation and to contribute to documentation. So there was sort of an outlined process and a timeline for getting getting feedback from the public on the details of the implementation guide itself, including on the actual metadata schema, which is really, I think, the sort of context of the standard that we're talking about here. And so it was November of 2013 was that first milestone. And there were a lot of tools and resources that had also been provided. So it wasn't just telling agencies like this is what you need to do, but also these are the tools and the support to help you get there. And to a large extent, our office at data.gov really lended a hand to help agencies along the way. And then we've worked with OMB to kind of help facilitate the kind of review and evaluation process. So with that metadata standard that agencies are required to inventory all their data assets, because it's a standard, we're able to have sort of an automated way. So we both have kind of this kind of quantitative automated measures, but also some qualitative measures that OMB does to look on a sort of constant basis to see how well agencies are implementing this policy and the standard, to see. So the very first step was just seeing, are agencies publishing this JSON file using this metadata standard to inventory all the data sets? Is that file even there? Is it following the standard? Are they meeting the sort of baseline requirements? And so we put up a dashboard that does that, which you can find at labs.data.gov/dashboard. And that's something that sort of goes through quarterly cycles, but also is analyzing this metadata like every 24 hours and refreshing that. And as far as the actual process for including the public in developing the standard, I was really much more intimately involved with that as a sort of revision to the initial version of the schema, because as I said, I actually kind of joined right before the first deadline for this, and actually after a lot of the work had already happened. But this is a living document. These standards are iterative, based on actual real world use and issues that were encountered. So because we have all this content, all these resources for the schema on GitHub and pointers to the issue tracker and ways for people to suggest edits, very quickly after that first milestone, we start amassing a lot of feedback about problems or suggestions on fixes. The metadata standard itself was actually already based on a existing standard called the Data Catalog Vocabulary, or DCAT, which originally came from an organization in Ireland called DERI, and then became part of the W3C process. But it wasn't actually a finalized standard when Project Open Data started referring to it. So over the few months after the policy was put in place, the W3C actually finalized DCAT as a recommendation, which included a few deviations from what we'd incorporated. So after the first initial implementation of this, not only did we get a whole bunch of feedback about problems or issues that people want to see addressed, but we also realized that we needed to align, better with the sort of broader international community and others sort of working on these kinds of standards. And so we sort of kicked off like a 3-month-long or so a phase of really concentrating on addressing all the feedback on the schema and working to align it with existing standards. So that occurred over the summer of 2014. So let me just bring up. See here. I guess, do I need to open a new? It's not already open though. Right. Forgot to do that part. So the website for this is project-open-data.cio.gov, and I'm actually going to go specifically to. It will look very familiar to you. So as Renata mentioned, the project she worked on was forked from this, and actually a number of other projects, both within the U.S. government as well as in other countries. I think the Mexican open data policy was also forked from this, and I think a few other countries as well. But just as one reference, so this is the changelog from version 1 to version 1.1, and so we really tried to group all the different changes that were actually made, and then link those back to the issue that sort of resulted in that change. So I think this is very similar. If you see software update, even in iTunes or Android or Google Play, when a new app's released, they'll say all the new features, and in some cases it'll be based on a bug report or a feature request. So this really allows us to sort of very clearly articulate all the changes that were made and sort of why they were made, and link back to the sort of public discussion with the community that led to that, which really I think provides sort of transparency and trust and sort of some accountability as far as being responsive to to the users and to the world. And let me refer back to my notes on other points that I want to make. So we also managed to, to align, in many cases, issues that had been brought up were presented opportunities for us to fix those issues while also aligning with DCAT. And so we engaged with the W3C and the community that had established DCAT, and that also allowed us to sort of get a little bit more specific about how we were using DCAT. So we're the Project Open Data metadata schema is primarily implemented in JSON. So we've backed that up with what's called JSON schema, which is a standard for defining a schema in JSON. And we also allow but do not specify but do not require JSON LD for folks who want to leverage sort of linked data approaches to this vocabulary. And so that sort of provided a good forum. GitHub provided a good forum for us to engage with the other participants in this space. If you're familiar with using Twitter to sort of like easily contact the other people who are involved with something, GitHub is really good at that as well. Just adding their username and getting the lead developers of some of these existing specs to sort of weigh in. Just phenomenal, like how easily you could sort of tap into that existing expertise. And so there's, I think, more work that we need to do with DCAT and some of the broader community to sort of make sure that we're all working together. But I think GitHub has really made that a lot easier. I would say that this is the audience that we've worked with for data standards and metadata. We are often talking with a very fairly technical audience. And we do always need to sort of remind ourselves that there's a much broader audience that we need to include and engage with. And there certainly are still, I think, a lot of usability issues, both real and perceived, with using GitHub for this process. And so it's also, not always necessarily clear that, that this website is managed through GitHub or what that means. In some cases, if people know what GitHub is or version control or distributed version control, that might actually sort of intimidate them. So I think there is still a need to sort of be more accommodating of people who either aren't familiar with this or might be intimidated for one reason or another. I do think just the simple functionality of GitHub issues and the issue tracker makes it a lot easier to get involved. Just as, it's very similar to just a commenting system or to using a lot of common social media tools. Like I was saying, being able to add other people. So I think having a good way of easing people into engaging through that, perhaps before issuing walking them through creating a pull request and that whole process is helpful and sort of easing them in. And there's certainly a lot of really good resources from GitHub, from the federal government, from lots of other people on using GitHub, which people should definitely sort of lean on for in reference for people who might be new. So I can also just sort of maybe briefly mention, there's other standards projects that I've also been involved in the past. So Open 311 is a common API standard that it creates effectively a standard API for interacting with a city's 311 system. So this is something that I've been involved with for quite a while, and initially that was developed in a similar process using different tools. It was kind of predated, I think, the popularity or availability of GitHub. So that was using MediaWiki, which is sort of a wiki similar to Jekyll and how we're using GitHub Pages for this, and just a common mailing list, and actually a separate issue tracker track that has since all been migrated to GitHub, just because it's both easier and I think much more social and more common for people to be using and to be familiar with GitHub, as opposed to I think some of the other tools that were more cumbersome. So the ability to migrate everything into GitHub was actually was helpful and fairly easy. There's still, I think, a bigger issue in terms of community management with these projects. So that's something, there's always, I think, a need for there to be real sort of time and resources to help steward these projects. Like any open source sort of endeavor, it really does make a difference to have people who can sort of help be the steward and connect lots of people and get them involved. And I think this also kind of gets into a bigger question of how standards are developed in the modern world and how government engages with standards development. So, there are policy and processes for standards in government that go back hundreds of years, the U.S. government is involved with some is responsible for some very fundamental standards that we might not necessarily think of as standards, such as the time, and location, and a lot fundamental standards for measurement, and the processes for that kind of work is, I think, very different in many cases from rapid sort of standards work in on the web or with evolving technologies where you might need something that's more agile and more more responsive to user needs. I think the UK government has demonstrated some really good processes around data standards work. So I think it's standards.data.gov.uk sort of outlines their process, sort of being really use case driven, user centered as far as either identifying existing standards that are appropriate for government or the needs to create new ones. So I think we have more we can do in that direction as well. But a lot of it is, I think, effectively redefining a lot of the traditional standards bodies' work and process, and sort of recognizing that there is a sort of more something that's much more akin to open source and not necessarily having as much of a specific standards body that's always going to be responsible, but it is still good to be clear about the principles and the openness of the process and making it inclusive and making sure that it actually works and solves real problems. And so I think there's more that we need to do to sort of be clear about that and sort of to articulate that there's maybe sort of a new sort of agile methodology that we need to be applying to this in a more consistent way. That's it for me, I think. Thank you.
One more session for you, Jairus. Oops. That's not that one. That's me. So this has been really interesting. I've noticed some really powerful themes coming through in these discussions. So Renata, I wanted to take out a pen and write it down. Basically your message was it's easier if you're more transparent. Things were easier for you because you were open and more transparent. And Phil mentioned Open 311. Open 311 is a standard that was developed 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. So about as more contemporary civic technology data standards goes, it's kind of almost an old one, in a sense. And it's actually how we met, I think.
I think so.
On the discussion list about Open 311. So there's another open data standard that is also sort of long in the tooth, I guess you'd call it. Anybody ever heard of GTFS? Who's heard of that? Okay, so most people. So GTFS used to be the Google Transit Feed specification. It's now the General Transit Feed specification. And in a lot of ways, it provides a template for the way that we develop another kind of open data standard. So these guys were talking about data standards that were, I think, largely meant to guide what data producers were going to do. There needed to be standards before the data was created around the Data Act and metadata to describe data that agencies were producing. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about another kind of data standard called it's BLDS. It's pronounced BUILDS, and it's the Building and Land Data Specification, and it's a data standard for building permits. And as riveting as that sounds, you should know that building permits, even though they may not have sort of the visceral impact of like crime data or even like restaurant inspection data, building permits actually tell us a lot about communities and neighborhoods. They tell us where construction's taking place. They can tell us how communities are changing, where gentrification may be occurring. They can tell us, give us a look at the economic health of a community or a city. And I don't know, who was here at last year's summit? Raise your hand if you were here. There was a really, really good talk on the main stage last year by someone who did a study at the Harvard Business School on transparency of operational data, right? He basically said governments that are open with their operational data can actually foster empathy on the part of citizens. So the more that citizens understand about the operational activities of government, they can actually foster goodwill. So if there was ever a self-interested reason for governments to push open data, I mean, getting people to like you better would seem like a really good one, right? And so building permits fall into that category. It's the kind of data that comes out of the day-to-day operation of governments. It may not seem sexy, but it's an integral part of what local governments do. So I work for a company called Excella. We're involved in this process because Excella has deep experience in the building permit process. My company did an internal project to look at our coverage around the country for another project, and we found that by our estimates, 25% of the US population lives in a jurisdiction that uses our software for building permits. So you'd kind of expect companies like ours to be in this process. There's a couple of other members of the group that put this standard together in the audience. If you would raise your hands, gentlemen. Eddie is over here. Seth, my colleague, is over there. Civic Insight is one of the companies. Ontodia is another company that was involved. I'll show you them in just a second. But the thing that's probably different about this story is that none of the people involved in the initial construction of this standard were in government. So who the hell are we to decide what this standard should be, and why the hell should governments adopt it once we say we're finished working on it? So again, the template of GTFS and what Google did with the general transit fee specification sort of come into play here. Whoops, I'm actually going to go right back where I came from. So GTFS had Google. It had a big company that could take this data and do something with it and show local governments an immediate tangible benefit. So why should I do this if I'm a local government? Or I'm a transit agency? Why should I put my data in this format? Well, for one, right out of the gate, you're going to get your transit data in Google, which will make it a lot easier to find. And if anybody here ever heard of Lives, it's a restaurant inspection data standard. Okay, so if you use Yelp, in some cities you'll see a restaurant grading score. Same template, same story, right? Yelp is a big, giant platform that can expand the reach of local government data. And in this case, we were working with Zillow because they, for obvious reasons, wanted to be able to show building permit information in their listings on Zillow's site. Right, so there's an immediate benefit there for local governments. They can expand the reach of this information. There's a benefit obviously for Zillow because they won't have to parse 1,000 different data formats from 1,000 different jurisdictions. But local governments also get a benefit because it's easier for people to find this information. And if we can give people assurances that the data looking at in Zillow is the official data from the city, then people are more comfortable with that data. They're more confident in its accuracy and completeness. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to walk you through the website for this effort. And it's actually built on GitHub Pages. GitHub Pages is a really easy way to deploy websites. We needed to be able to talk to some of our customers who are governments and tell them what the hell we were doing, because that was the first question they had. Where's the website? What can I read or point to that will tell me what this is? So we put together a really simple website. This is actually built on a framework called Bootstrap, which was also created by GitHub and then open sourced. But we used that to create this website, and it's on GitHub Pages. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to be able to show some of the cities and counties that were publishing this data. So as soon as the government sees that, they're automatically more comfortable because they're not alone. We wanted to give people a way to get involved, and you can see here, you can open an issue on the GitHub repo or send a pull request if that's what you want to do. We wanted to list all of the partners and contributors, and this is kind of interesting because there are a lot of companies involved here. And almost all of them are consumers of this data. So this was a group of data consumers coming together and saying, we really want this data from you. And if you give it to us in a specific format that's easy for us to work with, we'll expand the reach of it. We'll make it so much more visible for the people that you serve. Now, some of these companies here are competitors. We're also reaching out to some of our competitors to get them involved in this process because we believe that because none of this started in government, that the transparency that you get by using GitHub and doing this work in the open added legitimacy to what we were doing. Because the very justified question to our group could have been, who are you and why should we listen to you? We wanted to be very open. We wanted to bring people together that were experts in this and actually have them give their best recommendation on what cities and counties should do. So when you click on this link on the top here, data specification, I'm actually going to, I take that back. I'm going to go to the discussion forum. This will not shock you to find this is another use of GitHub issues. The discussion forum is actually a subset of these issues. It's the ones that are tagged with this discussion tag, or label, I should say. And I'll talk about labels in just 1 second. Well, let's just talk about them now. So labels are ways that you can designate different issues and group them together. And we wanted to give people options for how they created an issue. What do you want to do? Are you an organization that wants to sign on to this? Do you want to add sample data if you're a government? Do you want to report a legitimate bug with something, or suggest an enhancement, or ask a question? we wanted to be able to give people the options for doing that stuff. So if you look at just the general issue queue, you can see there's a lot in here. In the development of this standard, we went through 31 different issues where all of the people involved in creating the standard made suggestions. We started with a big list of stuff, and then we sort of winnowed it down. And the exercise that we're going through here is that building permit data is data that almost every government makes available in some way, shape, or form. It's on a website somewhere, or it's in a zip file where you can download it, or it's on an open data portal. It's all over the place. So the problem for us wasn't how do we set a standard that can guide future publication of data or future generation of data. It was how do we reconcile the differences between all the little nuances between the data that different jurisdictions have. And those differences are a function of their different business processes. So I don't know who here has gotten a building permit where they live. Anybody gotten a building permit? Anybody gotten a building permit in more than one jurisdiction besides Seth? Because I know he knows more about building permits in different jurisdictions than anybody. You have. Were the processes radically different, or were they somewhat similar?
Pretty similar.
Pretty similar, good. Sometimes there are important differences between what different jurisdictions will do. That's their prerogative. The challenge for creators of a data standard is how do you solve for those conflicts in a way that makes the data meaningful and easy to use, but not gloss over important differences, important details in the data. And that's really what this whole discussion was about. The interesting thing about this is, let me just show you real quick the pull requests. So this was another way that people interacted with this. You'll notice down here that the first pull request was for our Waffle IO badge. We actually use Waffle as well because it's a really easy way to display issues, GitHub issues, to people that maybe aren't familiar with GitHub but can understand the basic workflow once they see it in Waffle. It's a really great tool. So the interesting thing in this whole process was GitHub also has this notion of milestones where you can group together a group of issues. So we had this a bit of a dilemma at the outset of this. Everybody sort of agreed on what the 1.0 version was going to be, and 1.0 sort of universally signifies, yeah, this thing's ready for prime time. But right after that happened, one of the contributors said, wait a minute, we've just noticed there's an important variation from the 1.0 standard that one of our publishers has, and we want to make sure the standard covers that. So can we do a 1.1 release as well really quickly? So we decided to do that, and we wanted to group together there they are, a whole bunch of them together in a release. And this is one of the really nice things that GitHub lets you do. It lets you logically group together a bunch of changes, package them up as a release, and then work those. And when you get to your milestone, as you complete these issues, you sort of, this green line starts getting longer and longer until you've completed them all. It's a really, really great way to organize the work that you need to do. Now the actual standard itself, if you are so inclined to browse the details of this standard, is using something called GitHub Wiki. So this is a wiki that exists sort of in parallel to your GitHub repo. And very much like, in fact, exactly like the GitHub proper, it's a repo. It's something that you can clone and push to and do all the things you do with repos. But what's really nice is that, if you want to go and look at the core permits dataset requirements, it's got a revision history, right? You can go in. So as this standard gets developed and there are questions, why did you do this way? What change was made? Who made this change? All of those things are available by looking at the revision history for this. It's really super easy to use. I can go and compare the different versions and see exactly what was changed, what was taken out, and what was added. And so one of the things that the group needed to do that built the standard was we needed legitimacy, right? We needed to be able to answer the question for a government, why should I adopt this? How do I know this isn't just some corporate, you're pulling the wool over my eyes. I just want you to do this because it benefits me. We want to be out in the open. So transparency was really the only way we could get that legitimacy. So we insisted on as much transparency as we could have. And GitHub really provided that. Let me just go back to this is the main page of the repository. You can see there are a couple of, it has this Waffle badge here. There are 2 issues that are ready to go in our Waffle board. These are issues that we will take up at the next meeting of the group that is working on this standard. What's really nice about Waffle is that, and these are all GitHub issues. It's the same content that comes from the issue. It's just presented in a way that's much easier to use. So if we wanted to add, oops, I gotta log in, actually. I'm not logged in. Let's do this. You can all watch me log in. See, I'm winging this. There's no practice here. This is live. So if I wanted to, move one of these items over to be considered for the next meeting, I would simply do that. And as we move these things along the workflow, they get taken out of that GitHub open issues list. Super easy. The really nice thing about GitHub is that you've got this really cool ecosystem of utilities and tools that plug in. So it really lowers the barrier for people that don't feel like they use GitHub every day in their jobs, which if you're not a software developer, you probably don't. But I think this is important. The one takeaway that I hope we can deliver to everybody here is that, Phil made a point about, where we're going with data standards and how they get developed in the modern age. And I really think that this is the way it happens. And I think the more we can promote the use of these open tools, these tools that are transparent and allow collaboration, the more we can ensure that those processes that output standards are open and inclusive and collaborative. And I think that's really important. Yeah, I think that's it. So we have a little bit of time. I think we've got just over 10 minutes, if I'm correct, for some questions, if anybody has any questions. Yes, can I bring you this mic and then we're just going to hand it around like good citizens so we can do that? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Shel Kulp. I think my question is for Philip. Can you comment on the relationship between the JSON standard and maybe this spills over a little bit into this last discussion as well, but comment on the relationship between the standard that you've been working on and the federal enterprise architecture, as well as the National Information Exchange model. And what are those relationships? And it's sort of, the question is kind of motivated by sort of the allusion to some standards fatigue.
Sure. So the first question on the relationship between it and the federal enterprise architecture. There is some mention and some hooks into the federal enterprise architecture in the open data policy itself. So the federal enterprise architecture sort of outlines some basic sort of core principles for how, kind of best practices for how agencies manage enterprise sort of information systems, and sort of defines some categories and some sort of common structural approaches to take. There are actually some very fundamental ways where we should be tying those together better and haven't been. One very simple one is actually the FEA defines sort of a taxonomy for different kinds of things that the government does, and that those aren't actually really used by very many agencies to identify whether each data asset sort of fits into that category. So that's like one area where it should tie into, but in practice there hasn't been, I think, enough sort of guidance or follow through to sort of make sure that's happening. But the bigger picture, I think, of how agencies are managing sort of enterprise information systems is really core to sort of the intent and the success of the open data policy, which is to say that this should be something that's actually just integrated into the core of how agencies manage their data, as opposed to some separate afterthought or some parallel process as far as publishing data. In fact, I think the whole name and reference to the policy in this process as an open data policy is often a misnomer, often within the context of within government agencies, because it's really a much broader data management policy that covers actually all data management, not just that which is public. And so the agencies that sort of understand that, I think are scaling and doing a better job of doing open data properly, because they're not thinking of it as something separate, but they're actually integrating into the way that they already manage all their core information systems. But that's still, I think, sort of a gap that needs to be closed, that there is the principles of open data and sort of standards for how you're identifying and cataloging that, and inventorying that both for yourself, for other agencies, and for the public. That gap needs to be closed further. So that's something that we continue to work with agencies on. And standards fatigue and NEAM. So the NEAM and so NEAM is the National Information Exchange Model. For those familiar with schema.org, I think there's a lot of parallels. So schema.org is sort of identifies a lot of reusable taxonomies for describing all sorts of things. It's kind of a consortium of search engines that kind of work together and have a public process that's actually sort of goes through the W3C now. So that allows content publishers to use standard terms to mark up content, so that search engines sort of have consistent ways of identifying whether something is a event or a person. So in Google, that little sidebar, the knowledge box, I think is what it's called, that often will pull up like the direct answer to a question based on structured data. That's often using schema.org terms. So NEAM is trying to sort of do that a lot with common government terms and schemas and taxonomies. And I haven't worked very closely with NEAM, and I'm sort of trying to do a little bit more research to try and have a more cohesive approach to existing standards work and avoid duplication, and working with sort of NIST and OMB on sort of just better coordination on standards and avoiding fatigue and sort of. But there's still a lot of work to do just to sort of streamline and have a more coherent approach to standards work in the federal government. So it's still a work in progress, but happy to talk more in person on that.
Hi. I wanted to know if you felt that there was any added benefit or maybe detriment to versioning on the concepts in the model instead of the model as a whole, and if that adds to any collaboration, from outside the regular user group, if you find that that just adds too much complexity, or if it fosters collaboration.
The main focus of that was versioning. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, on the concepts, the terms, instead of the model as a whole.
So I think for on the Project Open Data metadata schema, it helped to sort of have clear, distinct versions, both in terms of the process for addressing a collection of needs and sort of having a set process of doing that, and then a set timeline to do that, and then also to have a validator that was sort of fixed to a particular version, so that we could sort of have a very discrete specific standard that we're measuring against, as opposed to, I think maybe what you're asking is having sort of organically evolving sort of the different fields and terms, which I think actually ends up being more complex, but there certainly are ways to do that through, at least theoretically, through like linked data approaches, and so we're trying to accommodate that. Haven't seen much real uptake or interest in that, so I think something we're trying to be accommodating for, but in reality, having just like a very specific, point in time version to measure against and to make sure everyone is aligned with seems to be the sort of simplest, most sort of coherent way to manage the process. Anyone else want to answer that one? No? Okay.
Hi, thanks. So I think, Philip, you've made reference to a couple times having structured schema like JSON schema to represent your schema. Mark, it sounded like you did use the GitHub Wiki to define your schema, and it seems like that's a more unstructured approach. I was wondering if you did in fact have a structured schema, or if you made the unstructured schema work and the trade-offs between that.
I think for the group that worked on that standard, it was the best choice we could make at that time. But I think if I can connect those the two questions, future versions of this standard may deviate on that. But I think at the point we were at and with the group that we had, it was the most sensible choice for us to make. At the end of the day, it was what's going to get us across the finish line so that we can actually start to talk about this and start to promote it and start to get governments to adopt it. And that was the choice we made. Yeah. Sausage making, I think someone on this panel said at the outset.
I can actually add on to the gentleman's question in the back. So when we released our schema version 0.1, it only had a subset of the data elements in there, and this next version has more than even version 0.5 had. So we are continuing to add, but at a certain point we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, that's it. Now we're going to add more features to the schema to make it more extensible or reusable.
Hey, so I'm Andrew Nicklin. You guys know me pretty much. I have a question about the kind of stakeholder part of the conversation, right? So finding the right balance of stakeholders and finding the right ways to facilitate those conversations, and I think there's probably a number of different perspectives between the three of you. For example, with lives, there's really kind of one private sector stakeholder, which was Yelp, right? And then there were a bunch of cities at the table. Mark, it sounds like with builds, there's a number of data consumer stakeholders and maybe some number of data provider stakeholders involved in the conversation. So is there a right balance or what is the balance to strike to make progress, not get bogged down in, sort of procedural organizational mechanics, and actually get work done? It's probably a very broad question, but sorry.
Yeah, you make a really good point. So, I mean, in terms of the work that we did on the building permit standard, we were using the playbook of. It's in some respects we're using the playbooks of Lives, but it turns out Lives is pretty much Yelp's standard at this point. In fact, we do work with them to publish data from some of our customers, and just kind of in passing in a recent conversation with them, they said, "Oh yeah, the version is different now. We've bumped the version and made some changes." And my question to them was, what's the process for that? How does that work? And it's pretty much they wanted to change it, and they changed it. And if you look at their webpage, it's changed. So I mean, how that's going to shake out in terms of its ultimate impact in adoption, there seems to be pretty strong interest in adoption among governments, at least the ones that I talk to. Not everybody, because I think that's restaurant inspections are kind of strange in the sense that they can really vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as you know. Where I used to work in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the city of Philadelphia, it's not a letter grade, it's not a number, it's a narrative. How do you condense that to a pass fail or a ABCD or a 90-100? It's difficult, and a lot of people feel very strongly about that. I mean, from our perspective, we tried to err on the side of including as many people as possible. I mean, to the point where it became a little ridiculous, because we felt like we needed to be able to say with no question that we were being as inclusive as we possibly could, big companies, small companies, just because we felt that would carry more weight with governments. We probably could have done it more efficiently if we didn't include as many people, but.
So I guess my take on it is that early on, it's good to have, I think a representative diversity of stakeholders, and ideally, two examples of people who sort of fill a similar role. So if they're a vendor in this spaces, like having at least two of them as part of the process, or if there's two or more common ways of approaching a particular problem, whether it's building data standards or 3-in-1, having a diversity of the common models for doing that as part of the early process. But at the early stage, not necessarily including as many people as possible, and instead maybe trying to focus more on proving out the sort of putting a stake in the ground as far as what a potential draft could be that actually you can demonstrate solves real problems of interoperability between different stakeholders, and then I think then you can sort of put that out for draft, show that there's actual running code working between different parties that can use that standard, and then get feedback. Maybe build that tent wider and get more and more feedback. And don't be afraid to have, I think, multiple iterations early on, and grow and grow that base wide early on. But I do think it's also valuable to have some kind of intermediary, whether that's a traditional standards body, some kind of nonprofit that doesn't necessarily have a financial stake in it, or in some cases government, to sort of play that role.
Yeah, I would agree with Philip. So you really need a data steward, someone who can see the standard all the way through and really develop it that initial phase and then get feedback from as many people as possible. But you need someone who can have a cohesive picture of it.
I think that's all the time we have. Can I just implore you to go out and make some standards, please? Thanks.